Go.
I actually came on Aliyah in 1970, and in those years, 1970 and the few years right after that, Yerushalayim was really a center of real intellectual and spiritual ferment. Apparently it had something to do with the years that immediately followed the Six-Day War. Immediately after the Six-Day War, there was really a feeling in Israel of you can almost say spiritual uplift, not only on the part of religious Israelis, but on the part of secular Israelis as well. There was a sense of being saved, the possibility of another Auschwitz, Chas v'Shalom, and sudden and speedy and almost miraculous events during 6 days in which the condition of the state of Israel was radically changed, not only from being in danger of being wiped out, but also in terms of the sense at that time, at least, that at that time there was no political issues of Palestinians and Palestinian states really didn't exist yet, and really the sense was, wow, we have suddenly returned to Yerushalayim and to Yudah v'Shomron, and apparently along with that there was the sense of the gates have been opened, the gates to a new and deeper understanding of Jewish identity and Jewish being. In a sense, one might say that the pale, the shadow of the Holocaust to a certain extent had been removed. The state of Israel had existed in a certain sense in the shadow of the Holocaust, and it was always possible that it could happen again, and here it didn't happen, even though a lot of people thought it might and could happen. In that sense, perhaps sort of a new dimension of Jewish existence in history, sort of gave people the sense here in Yerushalayim that the gates to a deeper understanding of Jewishness and Jewish identity and Jewish being and Jewish thought had been opened. And that was sort of the feeling the experience that I had in being here in the early 70s, early 1970s, here in Yerushalayim. There were a number of very, let's say, sort of mainstream institutions that are taken to be mainstream today that were pretty much created during those years. That was the beginning of the Baal Tshuva movement. There wasn't anything that was called the Baal Tshuva movement. And all the yeshivot that became sort of the Baal Tshuva movement were being created. On the other side, there was Machon Meir was created. Machon Meir didn't exist at that time. Rabbi Bravender was beginning to create his institution, and within that context, Michael Swirsky, who had come from the Chavurah movement in the United States and sort of the intellectual and spiritual ferment of rekindled and rededicated young scholars from the conservative movement who created the Chavurah movement, and basically created what at that time was what has now become to be New Age, was really just in the seed condition at that time in the early 70s in the United States, late 60s. The Vietnam protests and the whole new feeling of the new American identity, which was the late 60s, and here Michael Swirsky came out of that milieu and came to Israel and decided somewhere, I think in 1971, 72, in the context of the Jewish Agency, in the Youth and Aliyah department run by Mordechai Baron, who himself was a sort of a young intellectual who was running the Youth and Aliyah, the Youth department in the Jewish Agency. And Michael convinced Mordechai Baron to create Machon Pardes. Machon Pardes was part of this, the opening of the gates to a new sense of Jewish identity, Jewish being, Jewish thought. Okay, so he turned to 5 individuals, each one of whom you could say represented in his biography, in his own personal way, in his own individual way, this sense, this intellectual and spiritual ferment of those years. And so who were those 5 people? There was Rav Steinsaltz, Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who had not yet written the Talmud Stein. Zaltz had not begun it, had not created his own institution. There was Lahavdil ben Chaim L'Chaim David Hartman, who had not yet created Mechon Hartman, and nothing like that existed at that time. And Michael Rosenak, Lahavdil ben Chaim L'Chaim, who had not yet become the head of the Department of the School of Education. School of Overseas Education at Hebrew University. And there was Eliezer Shvaid, who had not yet received the Israel Prize for Jewish Philosophy, and had not yet created Kevin. And there was Aryeh Tweg, who was a leading biblical scholar at Hebrew University, who had written his doctorate on a biblical criticism approach to the receiving of the Torah, the parasha of the receiving of the Torah at Sinai, and who was the up-and-coming biblical scholar of Hebrew University, a religious Orthodox Jew, who unfortunately was killed in the Bar Lev line in the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so the first year of Mechon Pardes really was the germination of some of the major institutions in Israel today. Each one of those scholars had their own perception, their own vision, I would say, as to what this new dimension of Jewish education, the new dimension of Jewish thought and Jewish identity really looked like. But since they were still relatively young and had not completely formulated their own personal vision, they all came together here at Pardes in that first year. And I was privileged. Every one of them had a sort of an assistant, and I was privileged to be Michael Rosenak's assistant during that year. After the first year, each one of them realized, and I want to try to say this clearly, in the beginning of the spiritual movement, the beginning of the spiritual and intellectual movement, there was a lack of intellectual discrimination or discernment, a lack of intellectual and spiritual discernment. And so each one of them, or all of them together, felt that really they were pretty much in the same boat. They were the same school of thought, and they were, because all of them really were in this somewhere between the Haredim and the secular Zionists, and all of them really felt that they were speaking about a deeper understanding of Jewish identity and Jewish thought in a way that had not yet existed before, and in a way that brought together the best of contemporary thought, contemporary intellectual, philosophical thought, culture, and the depths, a new understanding of the depths of Judaism. And all of them really were sort of focused on that area that did not really exist in Israel. A lot of what we take for granted today in Israel, today, thank God, didn't exist in those early 70s, and it were a result of what these 4, unfortunately not 5, individuals created in the years to follow. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about David Hartman specifically. David Hartman in those years had just, I don't remember exactly when he came to Israel and Aliyah, but he came pretty much in those years. And he also taught, of course, at Hebrew University. I don't know exactly what his position was officially, but he lectured at Hebrew University. And what a lot of people may have forgotten was that in those years, when he lectured at Hebrew University, his lectures were attended by, if I'm not mistaken, 250 to 300 people, young men and women, every week. That is to say, even though there might have been registered in his classes maybe 20, 30, 50, they had to find a special ulam so that David Hartman could teach, could lecture, because there were 250 to 300 people who would come every week. What has to be appreciated is the fact that the professors of Jewish philosophy at Hebrew University were mostly, at that time, mostly Europeans, mostly Germans. And of course, David Hartman, what he did in that lecture hall seemed to them pretty primitive, because it seemed to them that a lot of what he did was theater and not philosophy. Because when David Hartman taught, he taught with passion, and he taught with a sense of deep identity and what he could do. And I remember this from Mechon Hartman as well, what he could do so well was that he could bring alive, he could bring alive the person who thought he was analyzing. He would analyze Buber, Heschel, Rosenzweig, my father Zichron Livracha, and Rambam, of course, and Soloveitchik, of course, and Leibovitz, Yeshaya Leibovitz. He would analyze their thought in a way that you could appreciate, in each case, you could appreciate how personal life, personal commitment, personal choice, right, became articulated within a broad and fundamental perception of Jewish philosophy. And so you were hearing Jewish philosophy, but you were hearing it in a way that connected personal existential choice in each case to the breadth and depth of a particular philosophical perception. And so you met Buber and you met Heschel. And he did it in a way that in each case you thought that David Hartman was Buber, and not only identified with Buber, but you could almost hear Buber speak. And people came from everywhere to listen to that, because it wasn't positivist philosophy turned into Jewish ethics, which was more or less what was happening, or classic Kantianism and Hermann Cohenism translated into contemporary Jewish philosophy, which was what was happening at Hebrew University. And so David Hartman's entry into Mechon Pardes was he brought with him everything that he represented in his lectures there at Hebrew University. Somewhere around that period, I can't remember the exact date, we heard that, well, he was actually connected, Hartman Institute was actually what today, what is Rabbi Brahmaner's Institute? Do you have any idea what it's called? Miftar, right? Yeshivat Miftar was originally the Hartman Institute. I won't go into all the details, but the understanding was Rabbi David Hartman's brother was the mashgiach in the original Bravenders, and the idea was that when David Hartman would come in Aliyah, he would connect up with Rabbi Bravender, and they would together run whatever it was that was called Bravenders, the Hartman Institute. It wasn't called Bravenders, it was called the Hartman Institute. And of course, when David Hartman came, both of them realized that that was not what either of them were looking for. And so after a year or two of being in Israel, David Hartman created the Shalom Hartman Institute. And the name Hartman Institute was taken from Bravenders, and Bravenders became Bravenders, and later on it became Yeshivat HaMiftar. But at that time, it was Bravenders, and David Hartman created the Shalom Hartman Institute, and we heard about it. Those of us who were concerned at that time and involved in this unbelievable opening of Jewish thought and Jewish identity, Jewish commitment to broad intellectual concerns that came from outside of Judaism, and on the other hand, a deep understanding of the existential dimensions, the personal dimensions of what's written in the Torah. And the possibility of bringing those together and learning Torah in a way that brought those together was exactly what I was trying to do here at Mechon Pardes at the time, and what I believe the Pardes Institute itself was its, how should I say, its flag, its flagship, bringing together broad intellectual and philosophical concerns with an attempt to understand the personal and existential dimensions of the inner layers of the Torah. Okay, so when David Hartman, we heard about the fact that he was beginning Shalom Hartman, okay, and it was clear to me that I was going to be there, and so we opened, the Mechon Shalom Hartman was actually opened in the loft of a synagogue in Rehov Beit Zion. I don't know the name of the Beit Knesset. When we sort of sat there in the loft, it was a very small room, smaller than pretty much the size of this room, maybe a little smaller. Danny Landy's office. And there are about 12 or 15 young men there, each of whom I can say, almost each of whom, have become important teachers in their own right, and important original thinkers in their own right. And each week, once a week, we would learn whatever it was. We would learn the Sugyot, we would learn the Sefer Brachot. And each week, there would be 3 people. Each time, there was sort of a Toranut. One week, David Hartman would give the Shir. The second week, Lahavdil Ben Chaim L'Chaim Menachem Fruman, Rabbi of Tekoa, would give the Shir. And the third week, Professor Menachem Kahana, who's become perhaps one of the leading Talmud scholars in Israel, would give the third shir, and each of them would give it in a different vein, in a different style. And of course, again, I want to say that we all thought that we were all in the same school, because we were all in the same school, creating something new that didn't exist in Israel at that time. Pardes was part of that. Machon Shalom Hartman was part of that. And we all felt that we were creating something new that didn't exist, and that was really the future of Jewish history. Maybe it was, because it has become pretty much a mainstream, all of this. Anyway, that's what we did there at the beginning, and then when Hartman moved to Chelimenu, etc., and brought and more people came. What I want to say about David Hartman specifically, which probably I'll try to conclude, there's no doubt in my mind today that whatever I do, whatever that is, whatever it's worth, whatever I do in terms of teaching Torah, David Hartman is clearly a model for me until this day. Even though I split from Machon Hartman after a couple of years on some very basic issues that I thought Reb David was taking Machon Hartman in a direction that I did not identify with, in terms of making it much more academically oriented than I thought was good for the project that David Hartman himself had created, something that we were doing at Pardes, that certainly openness to academic thought within the context of Talmud and Jewish philosophy and biblical scholarship was important, but that it wasn't the mainstay, it wasn't the ikar, it wasn't the primary dimension of the study. And the primary dimension of the study should in my mind, have remained in the context of personal and existential personal definition of self on the basis of an inner understanding of the Torah, with the broader intellectual concerns being the ma'atefet, being the envelope within which you broaden your thought and broaden your ability to think and broaden the issues that you are concerned with. But that I talked about why I left, let's say, but at that time, the way David Hartman taught Jewish philosophy, the way he taught Gemara, the way he taught Sugyot in the Gemara, became a model for me in the sense that he represented something without which, at that time in the Jewish world, many of us couldn't have become who we were. He said to us, it is possible to do something that isn't being done here in Israel. It is possible to have broad intellectual concerns, to read philosophy, to read literature. As Rabbi Soloveitchik did, as my father did, both of whom had doctorates in philosophy. And at the same time, to be deeply committed to Judaism and the Jewish people and Jewish history, the Jewish past, the Jewish covenant, and to understand the relationship between those two as being played out in my personal life, in the passion that I have myself, that I bring myself to my learning, to my attempt to understand Torah, and to my attempt to understand how the Torah, whatever I'm learning today, is translated into my own personal life, into my own personal being. But to do that not in the context of making it relevant, but in the context of being aware of the deeper issues of Jewish life and for the Jewish people, whether it is in the context of the development of the place of women in Judaism, whether it is in the context of understanding the relationship between commitment and freedom, the acceptance of the yoke of God and creativity, the social issues of social justice within the context of creating a Jewish state that could make decisions in public domain that were based on a deeper understanding of social justice and ethics in the Rambam, in Rabbi Soloveitchik, my father's works, but within the context of the questions of ethics that were asked all over in Western society as a whole. all of those things certainly were a great gift for me that Rabbi Hartman gave me, and I feel indebted to him until today in terms of everything that I do. Ad kan.